Welcome to Lead and Follow, a podcast that explores how great collaboration actually happens. I'm your host, Sharna Fabiano, author of the book Lead and Follow, The Dance of Inspired Teamwork. And I'm pleased to bring you the latest research, insights, and learning methods to help you work together better with the people around you. I help founders, solopreneurs, and new leaders become great at collaborating because I've seen how much more becomes possible when people integrate their ideas, perspectives, and strengths in a practical way. To learn more about coaching with me and for a one-time discount on your first session, go to sharnafabiano.com/coaching and enter the promo code podcast. The link is in the show notes. And now, here's the episode. I'm speaking today with Ashton R. Cooper, an assistant professor of higher education in the School of Education at the University of Cincinnati. His research and teaching seek to disrupt educational practices that are harmful to individuals and communities, and to empower practitioners and scholars alike to imagine and work toward equitable and inclusive futures. Doing so, he infuses his coursework with lessons in leadership and followership to model reciprocal and community-oriented learning. As a researcher, he uses historical and narrative methods to understand and explore followership as it relates to disrupting systemic oppression and building diverse, justice-oriented coalitions. This is a perspective on leading and following that I have been personally interested in for many years. And so when I saw Ashton's paper on anti-racist followership last fall, I was very eager to meet him. Lucky for me and for you, he agreed to record an episode to share his research and his current thinking on the leading and following skills we need for social justice work and beyond. Ashton, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Sharna.
You're so welcome. Before we get to this beautiful paper, I would love you to share the story of how your original dissertation project developed to give listeners a little bit of background on your longer-term work.
Absolutely. So I graduated with a PhD in higher education from the University of Tennessee in 2020. My dissertation, titled Not Accepting the Status Quo, Southern White Civil Rights Activists in the Civil Rights Movement, focused on a group of Southern white students who decided that they wanted to be kind of in the vanguard of change for Southern white culture. And these individuals did undergraduate education in the South or did graduate education in the South, and were highly active in organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, so the Congress for Racial Equality, and participated in things like the Freedom Rides and other nonviolent protests. However, as I kind of discovered through my research in the archives, a lot of these stories, while there are robust primary accounts, journal articles or newsletters and meeting minutes where these folks got together to kind of strategize, there weren't a lot of public-facing accounts of these individuals and their actions. 2020 seems so far away, but there was a lot happening socially at the time. And I wanted to not only speak to the moment of, hey, how do we encourage people that every small action towards an equitable future counts, but also how do we write back into the narrative the courageous actions of individuals who, by every cultural standard of the time, had nothing really to gain from participation in the civil rights movement.
I think I'm probably not alone in that I learned in high school to associate the civil rights movement exclusively with Black activists. So I really love that you are digging deeper here and asking this super relevant question, not only relevant then, but relevant now. What motivated white activists to participate in the civil rights movement? And then maybe how did they do that effectively? But I don't want to get ahead of us. I know that at this point in your research, you weren't necessarily using a lead and follow framework, but I wonder if you could give us a few examples of what actions those white activists took in the cases that you looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. So my dissertation picks up with 7 individuals across the South, and there are numerous definitions of the South, but we are using kind of the Mason-Dixon line, so everything pretty much below Virginia into Texas and Florida. These are individuals who come from various areas of the South, either the Deep South, Mid South, Texas, like I explained. And what I set out to do was, again, understand their motivations behind participating within the civil rights movement, right? And so they would tell stories of being in meetings and deciding that, okay, I can't, it's not beneficial for me to be in the front line of this peaceful protest. But what I can do is I can be on standby for bail, right? Or I can be the person driving the car. A really interesting story I heard from a gentleman by the name of Gordon Gibson, who was a grad student, and he was studying. I think he's a theology grad student, and he is now a Universalist Unitarian minister. And he responded to Dr. King's call to go down into Alabama to experience the conditions. So he was the white theologian, right? And his instructions were to just go down, observe, see what's happening, and report back. And he's telling me the story of coming into Alabama and seeing the conditions that the Black activists were subject to. And this isn't necessarily all of the negative conditions, right? These are also the positive conditions. So the being housed with other families, the building and sharing of community and culture between families, right? And he recounts that at this time, because these people were so tight knit, he was resigned to just being a conscientious observer, right? Someone who can take note and report back and provide suggestions. And then, as he was getting ready to leave, he decided to take a car ride with a local white woman and her family and just kind of see how the other side lived. And he's also like an amateur photographer. So he's taking pictures of the white areas in the neighborhoods. And it was like something clicked for him. It was no longer a question of whether or not he should be a quote unquote conscientious observer. He had to get involved because there was such a stark difference in the reality of, the pristine white suburban neighborhoods and, the not so updated, dare I say, like dirty, dilapidated conditions of the Black neighborhoods, on top of this idea of the freedom struggle for Black Americans writ large, right? And so what he says is it dawned on me at that time, right? It wasn't a necessity for me to be a participant for the sake of Black Americans. It was necessary for me to be a participant for the sake of white Americans, right? To be this bridge between the two worlds. And he also tells a story of he participates in the March on Selma, goes to jail, and when they get out of jail, the AP, the Associated Press, is there and they're taking photographs. And he shows me this picture of him standing next to Dr. King and a couple other people. And he talks about the perception of that picture. Here he is, just this grad student, right? I don't want to call him a nobody because he's not a nobody, but a grad student who is sent on assignment, being positioned The picture is really cool because there's some discourse that you can take from the picture. He's being positioned in front of Dr. King with Dr. King kind of staggered behind him. He says, the only reason why I'm in this picture is to grant legitimacy to what Dr. King was doing. And, to him, it was mind altering, but also it kind of speaks to, this need for greater participation by folks who, again, were not directly implicated in the racial justice movement of the 60s.
It sounds to me like Gordon Gibson here is almost discovering the role he has to play in the act of doing it. And maybe that's a role that even he didn't know existed until he showed up and allowed himself to have a new experience in real time. For me, it sounds like he's discovering the role of the follower, but that's just my personal hot take, right? It's fundamentally a support role that he has to play in the movement, not a directing role, for example. But let's fast forward a couple of years in your trajectory, Ashton. How did you later connect the idea of followership with this original study?
As a GA, I was teaching in a leadership program. Our textbook was the North House, I think either 5th or 6th edition. This is before the inclusion of followership in North House. And the only real mention of followers was, I think path goal theory. And even in path goal theory, they called followers like subordinates, and then leader member exchange theory. And so, the role of follower is a member of the organization. And it's both of those theories are, while they say they're focused on, the whole, it's really how the leader interacts with the follower, right? And not necessarily how the follower influences the leader. That was my understanding of leader-follower dynamics for a while. And it wasn't until I started digging into these narratives a little bit more post dissertation defense that I was like, wait a second, there has to be something that I'm missing. There has to be something that really explains the radical behavior of these individuals. And so I want to say it was actually McManus and Ferrucci. They give a liberal arts perspective. And so this is understanding leadership. And they model out a kind of model of leadership, and they distinctly put leaders and followers in their own spheres, and then they're working towards this common goal. And that was an aha moment of wait. There is something that I'm missing and possibly could help explain or just provide greater clarity.
What an exciting discovery. I can totally see how positioning leadership and followership on par together around a common purpose makes complete sense, especially in the work of social movements. I would love to read a quote from your paper that I think captures this insight beautifully. You write, "All the participants acknowledged the importance of deferring to experienced movement leadership. It not only allowed the participants to learn how their privilege influenced their perspective as white activists, but also how to properly partner with and advocate for Black people, whom the movement was meant to support." Could you say a little more about how you see the leading and following roles taking shape at this time in this context?
So in the case of my study, it really positions white activists as followers of the civil rights movement, not that they are just following the activities, but they're also participating in and following the instructions of Black leaders of the movement. And that's not to say that there weren't aspects that were led by white activists. There are numerous sources where we can talk about here's how white activists successfully led. But I think by only focusing on the social justice leadership aspects, right, we kind of grant this power to individuals to overtake movements that do not belong to them. And so, thinking about what was the role of white activists in the civil rights movement, I think on the surface level, you could say like, oh, well, it was to provide legitimacy to the concerns of Black Americans. I think there are other critiques that show that the movement for racial justice, as it intertwined with labor rights and anti-war, as we kind of move more into the 70s, we see that the fight for racial equity and justice was really a fight for all socially diverse individuals of the time to gain more rights and participate in a participatory democracy. And so, I think that these actions, right, were a sign of understanding what was at stake and how it went beyond just Black people need the right to vote so that they can be able to self-determine, right? It's like, hey, like these policies affect poor people too. And I can be of use by subverting the norm that me as a white person, that I know what's best for communities that aren't my own, but I can be of service to these communities, right? And then I can take those lessons back to the folks that I am in community with and organize those folks, right? And so like that's where we kind of move from that followership orientation back into a leadership orientation where we're taking the lessons learned from over here and then we're going back into our respective communities and saying like, hey, like these folks over here are doing this and here's how we can support them.
I'm remembering another story that you clarified for me a few weeks ago, the story of Stokely Carmichael, then named Kwame Ture, addressing many of the white activists who had decided to come be part of the civil rights movement. That's such an interesting moment. And I know I didn't get a clear explanation of it when I was in school. So I appreciated your nuance. Could you share that story and maybe how you think it demonstrates this ability to be able to switch roles?
There is a book. The title of the book is Organizing Your Own, The White Fight for Black Power in Detroit. The author is Say Bergen. And this is one of the first accounts where they are talking about the impact of Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, and his leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There are some misconceptions about Kwame Ture's purpose in assuming leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and him exiling or annexing the white activists who were members of the organization. And so there are a couple of things to note about this particular instance in the history of SNCC. One, there was an ongoing project within the organization called the White Folks Project. And this project was designed for the white field secretaries of SNCC to go into Southern universities and gauge the temperature of students on the campus for local chapters. This went on for a couple of years, and I want to say 1964 is when the White Folks Project turned into the Southern Student Organizing Committee. So this is called SOC. This is where the heart of my research is this organization and the members of this organization. So SOC only exists truly for 4 years, formally, from 64 to 1968. So 1967, 1968, Stokely Carmichael becomes the president of SNCC. And there's, this big pushing out of the white activists. And what I discovered from my interviews was that though there were reports of, hey, there's this schism within the organization, prior to that big announcement, he had gone around to each of these chapters that had been established, in these Southern universities, and basically piloted his speech, solicited feedback, and the whole point of that was for him to say to these white folks, "Hey, we've done a really good job over the past 8 years. We've pushed the social dynamic on college campuses to be a little bit more progressive. The Civil Rights Act had passed 1964. We've accomplished some major goals and some major aims. Now the fight isn't so much on our college campuses, it's in your communities. So what I think the most important thing for us to do is to now go into our individual communities and organize our communities to understand what we are trying to accomplish as an organization oriented towards the full liberation and full inclusion into the American democracy of Black Americans." And while these white field secretaries and organizational leaders were upset about it, right? It was, you work really hard to build an organization, and you have feelings and emotions, right? You want to be there to see the organization accomplish its goals, but they understood the power that they held to communicate effectively between people, right? Like this idea of being a bridge. And so, I focus on, in the followership paper, Antiracist Followership paper, I focus on the behaviors needed to be an anti-racist follower. And oftentimes, at least in these cases, right, some of those behaviors they're subversive behaviors, right? How do I subvert the norms of my community to be accepting of these progressive aims, quote unquote, progressive aims of marginalized people? And so, I think that picture, that episode paints a picture of folks who were willing to embrace their role as followers, right? They were willing to embrace not their role of followers. The truly radical thing is, I think they embraced Black leadership to then go and attempt to organize their communities. And if any of the listeners do pick up, the book Organizing Your Own, you will see that there were some positive outcomes, because as we kind of go into the 70s, yes, social justice activism does fizzle a little bit, but we start to see major gains in labor and anti-war and those things. So that dynamic kind of shows the flipping of the need to be an everyday leader, right? And shows the importance of how following can be more impactful at times for the overall goal and cause of an organization.
Yeah, 100%. I so much see the double role in that story and the need for the double role. And I'm sure there's much more detail we could get into, but you mentioned your interest in identifying anti-racist followership behaviors. I would love to know what those are, and I'm sure listeners would too. So could you take us a little further into your paper and lay out what you discovered there?
Further down the rabbit hole, Ulbin, I'm pretty sure I'm butchering their name, but they get into the dynamic of followership behaviors, right? This is how we know followership is occurring. And the 4 behaviors that I focus on are obedience and subordination, resistance, and proactive behaviors. And so, obedience and subordination, these are behaviors that either defer or obey or comply. The resistance behaviors are the behaviors that challenge and correct. And the proactive behaviors are behaviors where followers either seek advice or they engage in pro-social rule breaking, disrupting traditionally established norms. And I think that spoke to what was happening better than any leadership theory that I could find. You have the obedience and subordination to the goals and aims of the racial justice movement, civil rights movement of the time. And then you have the resistance towards white supremacy culture. And as followers, these folks were taking directions and orders from young Black radical civil rights leaders and carrying out those directions in hopes of accomplishing equity and inclusion into the greater American democracy. They were providing resistance to their socialized norms as being white individuals in the South. And it's really important to talk about the social context of the South because there were hyper-segregated areas. There were hyper-segregated schools, hyper-segregated churches. And so there was a feeling of, if I do this, I'm going against everything that I believe in, everything that I was taught. Even I am going against what my family stands for. So that feels pretty heavy when you are 19, 20 years old and you are developing your sense of self. And then we go into the proactive behaviors, and then this is kind of where I would argue the real magic happens when we start to talk about anti-racist followership. It is gaining the trust of the community, the organization, and then being able to carry out those needed actions independent of the greater movement. And so as we start to see white social justice organizations form, right, they are acting in coordination with Black-focused organizations. However, they're not acting on behalf of themselves, right? So they want to see the goals and aims of the civil rights movement come to fruition, and it is, hey, how am I helping this goal move forward?
This lesson of the double role and intentionally switching roles seems super essential for us all to get right now in the present day. Here's another quote from your paper. The Southern Student Organizing Committee was not a catch-all for all Southern white student participation in the civil rights movement. However, the organizational model of support for and not their leadership of the civil rights movement provided a template for all white activists to follow. Can you say a bit more about why this template works and why we as a multiracial coalition need to celebrate and fully integrate followership into our modern social justice movements?
Within the study of leadership as a whole, not only do we become romanticized with leadership in general, right? We fall back to this idea of great men and the notion of great men being that of those men who are forged in whiteness. And I say men very intentionally, right? Because it is this patriarchal view of leadership. Two, I think it's important that we have this dynamic where we're seeing white followers not kind of fall back and rest on their laurels and say like, oh, like, no, I'm a leader and like I should do this, because I think it speaks to the moment where we are trying to understand allyship and accomplicehood, and what does it mean to support and defend the rights of the marginalized. And I think what happens if we are solely relying on our leadership identities and what we can do to accomplish the goals of the organization and how I am going to move forward, it delegitimizes the views and concerns of the people who are being harmed. So while it could be beneficial to have that person who is like gung ho, like I'm a social justice leader, I can do this, it more closely resembles the actions of white supremacy than it does justice, because you're silencing the people who can actually speak to what their needs are at the time. And those needs change, right? As policies change, as organizations change. So being able to take a step back and say, okay, like, what do you need? How can I support you? Is far more radical than saying like, hey, I'm the face. I can take all the hits because that's just how I'm built. Because you are marginalizing those people all over again.
Thank you. Well said. It reminds me of that cliche, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And I also love that you put radical and followership in the same sentence, because it really is. I mean, for me, the essence of followership is service. What or whom are you serving? It's a very powerful thing, especially when there is an arbitrary social hierarchy in place that you want to erase. Switching roles is a great way to do it. So let's stay in the present day. Ashton, you are on a university campus. What are you seeing around you in terms of the challenges in teaching and learning, leading and following, not only in the abstract as concepts, but specifically as they might apply to the lives of students who do care about social justice and who want to make a difference in their own time?
To be frank, it's hard. There are certain state legislatures. There is a push from the federal government to sort of chill how we talk about supporting others who are socially different. And there is a lot of concern from students, right? And like, okay, well, how are we going to do this? And to me, that is the perfect door for followership to enter the conversation. Because in this instance, it is less about what we as individuals can do to kind of like lead the charge and subvert all of these things happening in our state houses and in our federal government, and instead turn to the people who are being affected and saying, hey, like, I know all of this is going on. What are some things in the short term that you need help with? How can I be of service to you? And that requires, some empathy, and, that requires both our students, undergraduate, graduate, all the way up to executive administration, exercising their empathy muscle, right? And learning how to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And I think that is really important to the act of followership. And then, once we have kind of this path to begin talking about followership and learning from other people, comes that switch of like, okay, now that I know what you need, what help looks like for you in this situation, right? I can then go back to my resources and advocate on your behalf. I don't want to speak for you. I want to carry your words to these people. And oftentimes I think when we glorify leadership, we accidentally give people the license to speak for others. And that's not helpful in this case, right? People's voices are powerful on their own, and we can be their microphones. So we can help their words and their ideas get to the correct places. We can contextualize their stories. As followers, we can elevate those who might not have the same privileges that we have to paint an accurate picture of here's how these policies are harmful and disruptive. And then oftentimes in that space, right, in that followership space, in that empathetic space, it opens us up to see how some of these things actually affect all of us, and how they are detrimental to our collective well-being, right? And so there's an element of learning that happens in that space as well that doesn't necessarily happen when we are solely focused on making sure that everyone is leading well, making sure that everyone is, focused on their strengths, right? And being these well-informed, transformational leaders.
Yes, absolutely. And because I can't seem to finish an episode without at least one tango analogy, I'll add here that when I'm in the followership role with a dance partner, by definition, by my position, I must be receptive in order for us to function as a partnership. I must open to receive information and direction from my partner. It's just how it works. And here's the big secret for non-dancers. It's also what makes it fun, energizing, creative. It is so fun to follow. Now, obviously, social justice is different from dancing in important ways. I would never say it is always going to be fun. However, in this way, I really do believe they are the same. This opening to be receptive to your leader, because it's the empathy and the openness that creates connection, and connection feels good and gives us purpose. And in a social movement context, as you're saying, that receptive skill is so valuable, because then when I go into a different room where I am in a leadership role, I have so much more knowledge and so much more perspective on my side that's going to make my leadership stronger. So yes, two sides of the same coin, as we say. Ashton, thank you so much for this paper. What's next for you?
I want to start to dig in more and clearly define, what I mean by anti-racist followership. Ira Chalif taking, his courageous followership and drilling down, making some specific recommendations for anti-racism, anti-oppressive actions, honing in on that and providing a comprehensive definition of what I mean. So, what I would say is, like, anti-racist followership, this paper shows that anti-racist followership exists, and it kind of helps us identify the actions, but there is no, hey, this is the definition of it. That's kind of the next research step for me, as well as thinking about all of the social aspects that aren't necessarily titled leadership or followership that contribute to our understanding. And so I have a paper in the works that talks about anti-racist capital and how we earn that anti-racist capital. And it speaks to that element of listening and empathy and being ingrained in a community, as opposed to telling the community of, like, this is what I think is best for you. So earning that trust and respect to be able to go out and advocate. And then, to kind of go back into the leadership space, reimagining what we mean when we talk about activism as leadership. And so in student affairs circles, we do have a good understanding, a large number of articles and research that speak to activism as a form of leadership. But as a careful critique of that scholarship, I think we need to factor in this conversation, as you say, like, both sides of the same coin, right? Like, what elements of followership are present in this understanding of activism as leadership, right? What does it take to be a good activist leader? And I would argue that it takes some solid followership skills.
I would agree with you on that. I am so excited about your work and really look forward to following it, learning more. Ashton, please let the listeners know where they can get in touch with you or learn more about your work.
So you can reach me at Ashton, ASHTON.Cooper at uc.edu. Also, you can search my name on LinkedIn. I am fairly responsive to my LinkedIn. I welcome critique and I welcome praise, but more importantly, I welcome collaboration and anyone who wants to go on this journey with me and build a community of scholars dedicated to advancing equity and justice is it's perfect. It's what I'm looking for.
Thank you so much. We will put all of that in the show notes. And once again, Ashton, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Shauna.
You have been listening to the Lead and Follow podcast. Special thanks to Glover Gill for composing our music. And a huge thank you to all of you who support the show. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or consider joining the Lead and Follow fan club for as little as $3 a month. There's a link at the bottom of the show notes.